Hello everybody. So today in the NEET crash course biology, we will be discussing about the chapter breathing and exchange of gases. So what exactly is breathing? Now breathing is also referred to as respiration. Basically, we need supply of oxygen, isn't it? To carry out all our metabolic activities, to also obtain energy from the food that we consume, we require supply of oxygen. And this process, that is respiration or breathing, allows us to exchange the oxygen from the atmospheric air with the carbon dioxide that is produced by our body cells and which is funneled into the lungs. So, from the lungs, we give away the carbon dioxide in exchange for oxygen from the atmosphere. So, this process is physical and it is referred to as the breathing. Ultimately, in breathing, what is the ultimate goal is? We exchange the respiratory gases, that is oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, you all are aware about the two types of respiration. Now, since we are dependent upon oxygen, since our body cells use oxygen, they utilize oxygen, we say that the type of respiration we exhibit is aerobic respiration. Now, in aerobic respiration, there are two phases. One is referred to as external respiration and one is referred to as internal respiration. Now, external respiration is something which happens between the lungs and the blood vessels, between the alveoli and the blood vessels. There is exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And internal respiration is something that happens at the tissue level. It's happening deep inside your body. That's why it is referred to as internal. External is more a superficial type of respiration that happens at the alveoli of the lungs, whereas internal is something that is happening at the tissues. To be very precise, it is between your blood. The blood has brought the respiratory gases, that is oxygen, from your lung, and the cells of your body, that is the cells of the tissues. Okay, then you have to remember that this cell, once it takes up oxygen from the blood, now the cell carries out another type of respiration that is referred to as the cellular respiration. Now, during cellular respiration, there is utilization of oxygen, there is production of water molecule. Okay, and it is through this process of cellular respiration that the cell is capable of obtaining whatever necessary energy it requires by breaking down the food substances. You will learn the details of cellular respiration in the later chapters. For now, remember the two stages in respiration are something which happens between the blood and the alveoli, that is called external respiration, and something that happens between the blood and the body tissues, that is referred to as internal respiration. Now, what are the different means by which this respiration or gaseous exchange is brought about? If you talk about single-celled unicellular eukaryotes, that is protists, they obviously will take up the respiratory gases from their surrounding directly across their cell membrane, so they exhibit simple diffusion. Even some of the earlier animals, like the most primitive poriferans, multicellular animals like poriferans and coelenterata, they also don't have any special respiratory organs or respiratory structures. They carry out simple diffusion. The cells take up oxygen from the surrounding medium of water and give away carbon dioxide into the same. If you talk about annelids like earthworm, they exhibit skin which is very, very moist and richly supplied with blood, so they exhibit cutaneous respiration. Then if you talk about arthropods living in water and mollusks as well as some echinoderms, they have special structures which are referred to as, mostly gills or ctenidia are found in arthropods and mollusca. These are feather shaped structures which help in exchange of gases. So remember, the respiratory structures in the case of aquatic arthropods and mollusca are referred to as gills or ctenidia. In echinoderms, it is mostly happening through the body surface. However, you are aware that in echinoderms like starfish and sea urchin and brittle stars, they have these tiny structures called as tube feet which may help in gaseous exchange. That a network of tubes, the air-filled tubes called as the tracheal system, is seen in land arthropods, especially the insects. Land insects, they exhibit the tracheal system. And then we have vertebrates like the primitive or the early vertebrates like the fishes. They are aquatic, so they depend on gills for respiration. And for the first time, lungs develop in amphibians. In amphibians, as you know, the larval stages respire through gills, whereas in reptiles and mammals and birds we have lungs, which are because we are completely adapted to a terrestrial mode of life. It is lungs or the pulmonary respiration that is mediated by lung is referred to as pulmonary respiration. Pulmon literally means lung. And then you saw in frog and amphibian, I told you that larval stages have gills. Of course, in an adult amphibian such as frog, it can also breathe through its skin, that is cutaneous respiration, and also the lining of its oral cavity, that is the buccopharyngeal membrane, and in addition to the lung. However, the lung contributes little. It is mostly the cutaneous respiration which helps in the survival of the frog, especially for example during the time of hibernation, isn't it? Then we saw in higher vertebrates like birds, there are lungs, including reptiles and mammals. But something unique about the lungs in birds is the respiration or the breathing process is supplemented by the presence of distendable air sacs, which enhance the efficiency of respiration. And that's how birds are very, very good at respiring, and hence they can travel very long distances in air. Then you have flatworms, they don't have respiratory organs, that is cell surface again. And we already finished discussing about earthworm, and we also talked about cockroach that belongs to insect, which it has the air filled network of tubes inside its body, which constitutes the tracheal system. Now coming to the human respiratory system. Now you all are aware that your human respiratory system consists of course, it starts off from the nasal cavity. We will look into the nasal cavity a little later. Now if you start from your larynx, which is called the sound box because you have a pair of vocal sacs, you can see a lid-like structure that is sitting atop your larynx, which ensures that food and water do not enter into your voice box or your sound box when you are swallowing the same. It should enter into the food pipe. Instead, it should not enter into the larynx. So there is a lid-like structure that sits atop the larynx, which is made up of elastic cartilage, which is referred to as the epiglottis. And then whatever air you breathe, whenever you're breathing, the epiglottis is open, and so the air can enter into the larynx, and then finally it passes through this unbranched tube, which is simply called the windpipe or the trachea. Notice that there are C-shaped rings all along the trachea. Now if this is the trachea, all along the trachea you can see these C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings. About 16 to 20 such C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings are present, so that air can enter freely, and the wall of the trachea, which is made up of muscles, does not close, it does not collapse. To prevent it from collapsing, there are several C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings which line the wall of your trachea. Now, at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebrae, now your fifth backbone in your upper back, which is called the fifth thoracic vertebrae. So at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebrae, the trachea will branch into two branches which are referred to as the primary bronchi. Singular is bronchus. Now the first degree branches of the trachea. Now this primary bronchus is the one that penetrates into the respective lung. So there is one lung on the right side here. This is the right lung and this is the left lung. And what you all need to remember is how this primary bronchus is entering into the lung, and it is further branching into a network that forms what is called the bronchial tree. And notice that there is a yellow colored membrane. Actually, it is a two-layered membrane that covers the lung. So all of you remember that this two-layered membrane which is covering the lung is referred to as the pleural membrane. In between the two layers there is a fluid that prevents friction, damage due to friction, and this fluid is referred to as the pleural fluid. Now the inner layer is in contact with the lung, and the outer layer is in contact with the chest wall, that is the ribs. Okay, so see here, this is the rib cage. You can see the cut parts of the ribs over here. So out of the two membranes of the pleural membrane, one of them is in contact with the lung and one of them is in contact with the rib, that is the chest wall. And then you can see these small sac like structures which are referred to as the alveoli. And like I said, within the pleural membrane you have this fluid which reduces damage by friction, which is referred to as the pleural fluid. And the smallest of branches which are found inside the lung, which terminate in alveoli, are referred to as the bronchioles. And another very important thing is, you can notice this muscular disc, isn't it? This muscular disc upon which your lung is situated, and this muscular disc upon which the lung is situated is referred to as the diaphragm. Now coming to the human respiratory system, now I had told you that I will be discussing the nasal cavity a little later. So here you have your nostril, and inside the nostril, the area in your nostril which is covered by hair is referred to as the vestibule, the anterior part of your nostril. And there are several bones projecting from the lateral walls of your nostril, which is referred to as the turbinate bone. There is superior turbinal, middle turbinal and inferior turbinal, and the entire area in your nasal cavity is lined with the ciliated epithelium, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which have fine hair-like cilia which help in movement of mucus, and the mucus will trap the dust particles of the air entering into your nostril. It is always advisable that you breathe through your nostril, because the air gets filtered. In the vestibule there are fine hair, and throughout the nasal cavity you have the ciliated epithelium, isn't it? So basically the air gets filtered, all the particulate matter gets trapped, and also your nasal cavity is richly supplied with blood, and as a result, which adds heat to the air, it brings the air to the body temperature. It also adds moisture to the air, it humidifies the air. And then you can see at the back of your nasal cavity, this part of your nasal cavity that communicates with your pharynx, this entire part which I am highlighting now is referred to as the nasopharynx, isn't it? And the opening is referred to as the nasopharynx, or the internal nair. This opening which leads from the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx is referred to as the internal nair. And then your air that you breathe in passes into your throat, and the throat region, as you all know, this part of your throat region is referred to as the pharynx, and then it enters into the next part of the pharynx, which is referred to as the laryngopharynx. So I told you this is the nasal cavity, and then this posterior part of your nasal cavity which I am highlighting here is referred to as the nasopharynx, and here is the opening which leads from the nasal cavity into your nasopharynx, which is referred to as the internal nair. Okay, and then the air comes into your pharynx. So that's why we say this part of your pharynx is the common passage. Actually this is the oropharynx, but isn't the oropharynx a common passage for both air and food and water? Because whatever you swallow also has to pass through the oropharynx, and the air that you breathe in through your nasal cavity also has to pass through your oropharynx. And now this part of your pharynx, which the lower part which I am highlighting now, which communicates with the larynx, which is the voice box, this part of the pharynx, as we had already learnt in the digestion chapter, it is referred to as the laryngopharynx. And now you can see the glottis, your voice box over here. The voice box, inside your voice box, it's not very clearly shown, but there are two strands or two vocal cords inside, and the space enclosed by the vocal cord is referred to as the glottis. So remember, air has to pass through your vocal cords, and that's when the vocal cords vibrate, and that generates the sound. And you can see a lid like structure sitting atop your larynx, and this lid will prevent water and food from entering into your larynx, and that is called epiglottis. Correct? So this green colored portion, including the epiglottis, is your voice box, which is referred to as the larynx. It is also called the sound box, and you can see two folds like I showed over here. The two folds are referred to as the vocal folds or the vocal cords, and in between the fold there is an opening through which the air passes, and that opening is referred to as the glottis. There are numerous cartilages that are found in your larynx. Now there are three unpaired. Totally your larynx has three paired cartilages. So all of you remember, there are three paired cartilages in your larynx and three unpaired cartilages in your larynx. Okay, so larynx or the voice box has three paired and three unpaired. Now, what are the three paired? The three paired are arytenoids, corniculate, and cuneiform. And the unpaired are the thyroid cartilage, which has a bulged projection called the Adam's apple. Then there is the cricoid cartilage, and lastly the lid like structure, which I told you is the epiglottis. Most of them are hyaline except epiglottis, which is elastic cartilage. Okay, so basically your larynx or the sound box, you must remember the three unpaired and the three paired cartilages. So I will show a simple representation here of your larynx. So if this is the front of your larynx, there is a cartilage which a bulge on it. Now this is the thyroid cartilage. So let me give it symbols. For thyroid I will write T, for cricoid I will write C, for epiglottis I will write E, for cuneiform I will write Cu, for corniculate I will write CO, for arytenoid I will write A. So this is the thyroid cartilage in the front, and then below the thyroid cartilage there is a cartilage which looks like an L-shaped cartilage. This L-shaped cartilage is the cricoid, which is unpaired. So you can imagine this like a cup-shaped structure in the front of the cup-like structure. So just let me put an outline so that you can imagine a cup-like structure here. Okay, so in the front you have the thyroid cartilage, in the back you have the cricoid cartilage. Cricoid cartilage is L shaped. Of course you're seeing only one side of it. Remember, this is the side view of the larynx. Okay, now in your side view you cannot see much details of it. The cricoid cartilage is a ring like cartilage because there is space here for the air to pass through it. Okay, then attached to the thyroid cartilage we already saw that there is a lid like cartilage, and this is referred to as, always remember, the thyroid cartilage is what is attached to the epiglottis, which is E. And then from the cricoid cartilage, sitting on top of the cricoid cartilage, you have these two. Now this side, as well as there is one on the other side, which is referred to as the arytenoid cartilage. So let me call this as A. So A is paired, as you can see. And sitting on top of arytenoid cartilage, there are two horn-like cartilages, which is referred to as the corniculate. Okay, and in the wall of the larynx, which you cannot very clearly identify, there will be paired cartilages, which are referred to as the cuneiform cartilages. And then now see this arytenoid, there is a projection in the front of the arytenoid cartilages. To this you have the two cords which are attached like this. See, now this is your vocal cord, and can you see the space inside the vocal cord? Now this is the glottis. The air passes through that space and it enters into your larynx. Okay, so basically we have one thyroid, one cricoid, and then we have one epiglottis. We have two arytenoid, two corniculate, two cuneiform in the wall, which is covered up with muscles. You cannot see the cuneiform cartilages. It's a very rough, it's looking as if it's hanging in the air, but remember it's beside the arytenoid cartilages. And as you can see, upon the cricoid cartilage you have the arytenoid cartilage that is sitting on like a horn on the arytenoid cartilage is the corniculate cartilage. And the projections of the arytenoid, now these are the, what I'm highlighting here for you, these are the projections of the arytenoid cartilage, and these projections of the arytenoid cartilage are attached to these two folds, which are referred to as the two cord like structures, which is simply called the vocal cord. Okay, now here you can see we have discussed about the structure of and I forgot to tell you this bulged part. Yeah, so this bulged part of the thyroid gland is what is referred to as the Adam's apple, isn't it? So the Adam's apple is nothing but that you can feel in your throat region, and it is very prominent in the male, and this bulged portion is what is referred to as the Adam's apple. It is a part of the thyroid cartilage. Now moving on to the trachea and what is referred to as the bronchi. So we saw that the trachea, as it moves down, I told you that the trachea has 16 to 20 C-shaped hyaline cartilaginous rings, and then you can see at the level of, can you recall and tell me at what level does the trachea actually branch? The trachea branches at the level of the fifth thoracic vertebrae into two branches, that is one that is passing into the left lung and one that is passing into the right lung, and these branches are referred to as the primary bronchus. What happens to the primary bronchus once it enters? See, it's entering into the lung. So once it enters the lung, what happens to the primary bronchus is what we can see here. So this is the left primary bronchus that is entering into your left lung. So this dotted line represents your left lung. If you can remember, it is the primary bronchus that enters into your lung. So notice how it is branching. The primary bronchus, it branches into the second degree branches, which is referred to as the secondary bronchus. The secondary bronchus branches into even more finer branches, the second degree and the third degree bronchi, which is referred to as the tertiary bronchi. And then the branching continues and continues and continues, and notice that the tubes become very, very thin, and the thinnest of tubes are referred to as the bronchioles. Now these bronchioles which are labeled over here are the initial ones. These are referred to as the initial bronchiole, and the initial bronchioles do have cartilage in their wall. Okay, and then you can see the terminal ones appear bare, and these are referred to as the terminal bronchioles. And now if this is a terminal bronchiole, the terminal bronchiole then branches into even more finer branches which are called respiratory bronchiole, and the respiratory bronchiole receives ducts which are called alveolar ducts, which are ending in these sac-like structures which are referred to as alveoli. So remember that these are the terminal bronchi. I am writing it as T. The terminal bronchi branch into respiratory bronchi, which is referred to as R, and the R receives these ducts which are referred to as AD, alveolar duct, and these sac-like structure are nothing but the alveolus. Okay, so basically this is the branching pattern. We call this as the bronchial tree. And up to the initial bronchioles, like I told you, you can find cartilaginous rings in them. And very, very important, starting from your nose, that is your nasal cavity, to the point of the terminal bronchioles. The terminal bronchioles are those which don't have the hyaline cartilage ring in their wall. So this entire region, starting from the nasal cavity to the terminal bronchiole, they do not help in breathing. So we call this as the conducting division. They only help in transport of air. They only help in passage of air. They do not help in breathing. But I told you that in the end you have the respiratory bronchiole. The respiratory bronchiole, then the alveolar duct, and then the alveoli. Even in respiratory bronchiole, certain amount of the gaseous exchange takes place. Therefore, this part is referred to as the respiratory division. Okay, so from the nasal cavity to the terminal bronchiole, it is called conducting division. From respiratory bronchiole and the alveoli, it is referred to as the initial bronchiole. Like I told you here, all of you notice the terminal bronchiole branches into respiratory bronchiole, and like I have shown in this representation, the respiratory bronchiole receives finer ducts which are referred to as alveolar ducts from pouch-like structures which are aggregated into a structure which is referred to as alveolar. Actually, this is referred to as alveolar sac. See the diagram here. This entire portion is referred to as alveolar sac. The individual cup-shaped portions which is found parts inside this is referred to as the alveolus. So what is this duct coming out of the alveolus? It is the alveolar duct. And see how the alveolar duct are received by what? Now this is the respiratory bronchiole. The respiratory bronchiole goes and joins the terminal bronchiole. Then we have initial bronchiole, then tertiary bronchiole, secondary bronchiole, primary, the first degree branch, and the major branch, the trunk of the respiratory tree, which is referred to as the trachea. Respiration involves, the major steps in respiration involves, first one is breathing, isn't it? Now, in breathing, what do? You exchange the oxygen rich atmospheric air with carbon dioxide rich air in your alveoli. So, you're releasing the carbon dioxide rich air and you're taking in the oxygen rich atmospheric air. So, that is by breathing in and breathing out, which is inspiration and expiration. And then, once the gases have moved into your alveoli, they diffuse between the alveolus and your blood vessels. So, diffusion and exchange of gases on the surface of the alveoli. Do you remember what we called this? Whatever happens between the alveolus and your blood vessel, we call it as external respiration. Then, once the gases enter your blood, they are transported in your blood, so transport of gases. And then, where are the gases taken? The gases are taken to the tissues where exchange takes place. Do you remember what that exchange is called? The exchange of gases between your blood and your tissue is referred to as internal respiration. And then, utilization of oxygen. The oxygen is used by the cells. The cells take up this oxygen and they break down the food substances by a process called catabolic process. The byproducts of that is release of water and carbon dioxide molecule and consumption of oxygen. This process is referred to as the cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is nothing but catabolism, because larger substances, complex chemical substances, are broken down into simpler inorganic substances like water and carbon dioxide, which is given out as a byproduct of catabolic or cellular respiration. So, these are the major steps in respiration. Mechanism of breathing. Now your lungs, now this red colored structure is your lungs, which is shown over here. Now this is the side view. In the front you can see your ribs in your chest. In the back you can see your backbone. So actually your lung is situated in the thoracic cavity. Okay, now between the ribs you find certain muscles. Let me label these muscles over here, that is extending between the ribs, which are referred to as the intercostal muscles. And there is a muscle which is basically a muscular disc which is present below your lung, which is referred to as the diaphragm. Both the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm are made up of striated muscles. Now the lung is the anatomical setup, that is your lung is situated in your thoracic cavity in such a way that it is an airtight chamber. Whatever changes are brought about in the volume of the thoracic cavity, the cavity in which your lung is situated, so whatever changes are happening in the volume and the pressure of the thoracic cavity, they are reflected as the volume and the pressure of the lungs. Okay, so whatever changes are happening in the volume and pressure, they're reflected in the volume and pressure of your lungs. This kind of an anatomical setup where your entire thoracic cavity becomes airtight is something which is required for breathing. Now when you breathe, you have inspiration. This is inspiration or inhalation. The first step of breathing is called inspiration or inhalation. The next step of breathing is called expiration or exhalation. Now notice how during inspiration your ribs are moving outwards. Now when your ribs move outwards and your diaphragm is what is happening to the diaphragm? It is contracting. Now when it contracts, it becomes flat. It is usually curved like a dome, but now it is contracting, it is becoming flat. So now you tell me what will happen to the lung. There is lot of space, because when the diaphragm becomes contracted, it moves down, and when the ribs contract and they move out, what will happen to the volume in your lung? Now the volume will increase, and you know that volume and pressure are inversely proportional. So the pressure in your lungs will decrease, because lung is saying, oh, I have more space. The rib has moved out, the diaphragm has come down. So let me now relax. The lung is relaxed, it has more volume. The pressure inside the lung will fall. Now the pressure in your lung, like I told you, is falling, but the atmospheric pressure is high. That means the pressure falls below the atmospheric pressure. Okay, we are not going to alter the atmospheric pressure, we can't do that. So we have to alter the pressure in the lungs. So obviously air will now flow from the higher pressure that is in the atmosphere to the lower pressure that is inside your lung. So remember, when your lungs are very relaxed, there's lot of space for your lung. So the lungs are very happy because they are not very very squeezed inside, so their volume is high, their pressure falls. How much does the pressure fall? The pressure falls below the atmospheric pressure, and as you all know, gases or air will always flow from higher pressure to lower pressure. As a result, air from the outside will automatically gush into your lungs. Now, the opposite happens in the case of exhalation. Notice how your ribs are moving in. See, because of the muscles of your ribs, the ribs are as in they're relaxing. Here they had contracted to move out. Now it is the opposite. The rib muscles will relax, and so the ribs will move inwards and downwards. And then the muscles of the diaphragm will also relax. When the muscles of the diaphragm relaxes, it will arch upwards. And now imagine who is getting squeezed. The lung is getting squeezed. There is no space for the lung. So what happens to the volume in the lung? It is getting squeezed. So the volume is falling and the pressure is increasing. Pressure is increasing compared to what? Compared to the atmospheric pressure. So the pressure is more inside the lung compared to the atmospheric pressure. So where will the air go now? From higher pressure to the lower pressure. So air will gush out of the lung, and that is referred to as exhalation. Okay, so remember, during inhalation the ribs move upwards and outwards and the diaphragm moves downwards, it becomes flat. During exhalation the ribs move inwards and downwards and the diaphragm becomes dome shaped. Basically what is happening in inhalation, now just so that you understand, the inhalation, the lungs are not squeezed because they have lot of space inside, they're very happy inside, lot of spaciousness. But in exhalation, sadly, the lungs are experiencing squeezing, as in they are squeezed in the sense the pressure inside the lung is very high in comparison to the atmospheric pressure. So air will always flow from higher pressure to lower pressure. Okay, exchange of gases. Now once the gas has reached into your alveoli, the air has reached into your alveoli, notice that the oxygen, say for example the oxygen, if it has to enter into the blood, see there is a capillary surrounding the alveoli. Let us count the number of layers it has to cross. So first I'm putting a dot here. It has to cross the layer, the lining of the alveolum, and then you can see here there is a yellow colored zone which is the basement membrane. It has to cross the second layer, and then it has to cross the squamous cells of the blood vessel, that is 3 layers. So for the air, for the oxygen to enter into the blood, it has to cross these 3 layers, which is called the diffusion boundary. However, all these 3 layers are less than 1 millimeter in thickness, and therefore it allows the air to flow very very easily across the alveolar wall. So like I said, there is the alveolus and there is blood vessel that is surrounding the alveolus. First you have to cross the barrier of the cells which are lining the alveolus. We saw that the alveolus is lined with squamous cells, and then it has to cross the basement membrane, and then there is a lining of cells in the inner wall of the blood vessels which is called the endothelium, which is the squamous epithelial layer. So basically 3 different layers. So finally there is RBC sitting inside, so oxygen needs to enter into the RBC. So this is the blood capillary, so I'm going to write here as the blood. This is the basement membrane. This middle layer is where there is lot of connective tissue, and this is referred to as the basement membrane. And then this is the lining of the alveolus, or we can say, we can call this as the alveolar epithelium, which is made up of simple squamous epithelium. So if I am an oxygen molecule, first I have to cross the alveolar epithelium, then I have to cross the basement membrane, then I have to cross the endothelium and reach the blood. So what are the barriers I must cross? 3, and they make up less than 1 millimeter. However, carbon dioxide is so fast in diffusing that it diffuses 20 to 25 times greater than oxygen. That means carbon dioxide is very very quick in diffusing in comparison to oxygen. So you should remember, and also very importantly, you should remember that this process, what do you call this process, which is happening between your alveolus and between the blood vessels, the blood capillary, are we talking about internal respiration or external respiration? We are talking about external respiration. Remember, the respiration that happens between the alveolus and the blood vessel is referred to as external respiration. Now, exchange of gases. What actually drives the gases to flow? Now, like how a solute particle may flow from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. We don't use the word concentration for gases. The gases always flow from a higher partial pressure. Now, the partial pressure is the measure of the amount of gas that is present, the concentration of the gas at a particular point. So gases always flow from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. Now generally we represent this as partial pressure of oxygen, PO2, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and so on and so forth. So remember that gases flow from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. Now let us see why this exchange is happening here between the alveoli and the blood. What kind of blood is reaching the alveoli? Now the blue blood actually represents deoxygenated blood. Deoxygenated means it is poor in oxygen, and the red blood basically represents oxygen rich blood, which is heavily saturated with oxygen. Now, deoxygenated blood is coming through the pulmonary artery into the alveoli. In the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is very high, it is 104. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very low, 40. Whereas in the deoxygenated blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, it is 45, and the partial pressure of oxygen is very low, it is 40. So, where do you think the gases will exchange now? On one side, we have partial pressure of oxygen 104. On one side, we have partial pressure of oxygen 40. On one side, we have partial pressure of carbon dioxide 40, and we have 45. So, this is at the alveolus, and this is in the deoxygenated blood. So you can imagine oxygen will flow from the alveolus into the deoxygenated blood. That is because the partial pressure of oxygen is higher here, it is lower in this case. Carbon dioxide will diffuse from the deoxygenated blood into the alveolus. So remember, the flow is happening, so blood receives oxygen and blood gives away carbon dioxide to the alveolus. So by the time the blood has reached from this side to the other side, what has happened to the blood now? The blood has become oxygenated. In the oxygenated blood, the partial pressure of oxygen is 95 millimeter per mercury, and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is only 40 millimeter per mercury. Now, who is the blood vessel that brings this oxygenated blood back to the heart? It is the pulmonary vein. And from the heart, who is the blood vessel which carries this oxygenated blood to all the parts of the body? It is the systemic artery. The systemic artery will carry the oxygenated blood to your tissue. See, this is the partial pressure of your oxygenated blood. In the tissue, the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 and carbon dioxide is 45. So let me again write here at tissue, and in which kind of blood? Oxygenated blood. So at tissue, partial pressure of oxygen is very low, 40. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher than oxygen, 45. In oxygenated blood, partial pressure of oxygen is very high, 95 millimeter mercury. Partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low, that is 40 millimeter mercury. Obviously from the blood, oxygen will enter into the tissue. So this is internal respiration, isn't it? Why? Because it moves from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure. So the blood will deliver oxygen to the tissue. From the tissue, the carbon dioxide will leave the tissue and enter into the blood, because in the tissue, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high. In the oxygenated blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low. So remember the direction of movement. Here also it was from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure, higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. So you can imagine the oxygenated blood is giving away all its oxygen to the tissue here, and it is taking up all the carbon dioxide. So what will happen to the oxygenated blood over here? It becomes deoxygenated. And like I had written there, for deoxygenated blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide has increased to 45, and in oxygenated it was 40. And oxygenated blood, see how less the oxygen is. It was 95, but now it is 40. And who takes this oxygenated blood back to your heart? It is the inferior and the superior vena cava, which bring the blood from the veins, and all the vein blood is collected by the vena cava, which drain the blood back into the right atrium of your heart. So basically, you should remember, in this picture, the red represents oxygenated blood. You have to learn the value of partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide of oxygenated blood. The blue represents deoxygenated blood. Please learn the value, and you should know how much is the partial pressure of O2 and CO2 in the alveolus, how much is it in the deoxygenated blood, how much is it in the tissue, how much is it in the oxygenated blood. If you don't know the value, you will not be able to tell where the oxygen and carbon dioxide flow. Okay, in the alveoli, like I mentioned, carbon dioxide, here all of you look here, in the alveoli, oxygen leaves the alveolus and enters the blood. Carbon dioxide exits the blood and enters the alveoli. It is the reverse in the tissue. Oxygen leaves the blood and enters the tissue, and carbon dioxide leaves the tissue and enters the blood, and therefore the blood becomes what? Blood becomes deoxygenated. Okay. Transport of gases: 3% of oxygen is transported in dissolved state, 97% of oxygen is transported in combination with hemoglobin. That is, one molecule of hemoglobin can combine with 4 molecules of oxygen reversibly to form a complex that is called the oxyhemoglobin complex. And this oxyhemoglobin complex is formed inside the RBC. So we say that 97% of oxygen is transported in the form of oxyhemoglobin. What about carbon dioxide? Only 20 to 25% of carbon dioxide is transported in RBC. Now, when carbon dioxide is combining with hemoglobin, it forms a special complex and irreversible reaction which is referred to as carbamino hemoglobin. Okay, so it is not carboxyhemoglobin. Carboxy is because of carbon monoxide, but here I'm talking about carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin. How much of it? 20 to 25% in order to form a carbamino hemoglobin. 70%, the most highest amount of carbon dioxide, is transported in the form of bicarbonate, that is HCO3 minus ion, and only 7% of it is carried in the dissolved state in the plasma. To understand, I already told you that oxygen combines with hemoglobin reversibly to form a complex that is referred to as HbO24, and we saw that oxygen binds with the hemoglobin molecule, the iron part of hemoglobin molecule, and basically it can bind to a maximum of one hemoglobin has 4 globin chains and 4 heme groups, isn't it? So therefore we can say that one hemoglobin molecule binds to 4 oxygen molecule. That's why the complex formed is written as HbO2 4 times. Okay, then on an average 1 gram of hemoglobin carries 1.34 ml of oxygen. So every 100 ml of your oxygenated blood has about 19.4 ml of oxygen carrying in it. So remember that there is about 1 gram of hemoglobin which can carry 1.34 ml of oxygen. So in 100 ml of blood there will be about 19.4 ml of oxygen. Now, to understand the oxygen and hemoglobin relationship, we need to learn a curve that is called oxygen dissociation curve. Now, on the y-axis, they have given percentages, how much of oxygen is bound with hemoglobin. This is called percentage saturation. Saturation means how much of oxygen has successfully combined with hemoglobin. On the x-axis, we are taking partial pressure of oxygen. Okay. Now, notice as you move along the x-axis, as you increase the partial pressure of oxygen, the affinity, that is hemoglobin and oxygen, are binding together, and the saturation between hemoglobin and oxygen is also gradually increasing. So what does this mean? This means higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the hemoglobin and oxygen become friends with each other, and therefore they remain as, or they start forming a complex that is referred to as hemoglobin, that is oxyhemoglobin. Okay, now where do you find a higher hemoglobin, I mean PO2? So let me take the PO2 at, say for example, the tissues. It is somewhere, sorry, at your lungs. At your lungs, say for example, it is 104 millimeter per mercury. So you can expect almost, it is obviously not 100% saturation, but you can expect that at a partial pressure of 100 or close to 100, that is PO2 at your alveoli, if you consider, then you can say that there is almost 100% saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. Now what about the partial pressure of oxygen in your tissue? Partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue is 40 millimeter per mercury. So if I draw a vertical line to the curve and if I extend it, see the percentage saturation, it is somewhere between 75 to 80, probably. Let me take it as 75% saturation, and here let me take it as 95 to 100% saturation. So now tell me why the saturation is so high at the lung, because partial pressure of oxygen is very high at the lung. And why the saturation has fallen down in the tissue, why not enough hemoglobin is combining with oxygen, because the partial pressure of oxygen at the tissue is only 40 millimeter mercury. So if there is more partial pressure in case of the oxygen, then what happens is hemoglobin is bound, is saturated with oxygen. That means hemoglobin goes and binds, they become friends. If there is less partial pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin and oxygen become enemies, so they dissociate with each other. If they dissociate, what will happen to the saturation? The saturation will obviously come down. So this is what you can understand, that as you increase the partial pressure, that is, if you take the x-axis, the right side of the x-axis is something which you can expect closer and closer as we reach the alveolus, and as we move towards the left side of the x-axis, we are moving closer and closer to the tissue, because in the tissues you know that the partial pressure of oxygen is 40. And why there is a fall in the percentage saturation? Like for example, let me take a quick graph again. So this is the oxygen dissociation curve. I told you that at the lung there is a very high partial pressure of oxygen, and the saturation is almost how much? 90 to 100%. And then we saw, as we started moving towards the left side of the x-axis, I moved from a partial pressure of oxygen of 100 to a partial pressure of oxygen of 40. Why did I take 40? Because 40 is what is in the tissue, and I showed you that on drawing a vertical, how much did I get? I got about 75%. So now why there is a fall in saturation is what you need to learn. From 100, the saturation has come down to 75%. That means some oxygen is given out by the hemoglobin. Oxygen and hemoglobin have become enemies. So hemoglobin says, I don't want this oxygen, and who takes up the oxygen? The oxygen is given to the tissues. So it is very important that hemoglobin and oxygen also become enemies, so that oxygen is available to the tissue. Okay, so initially hemoglobin had 100 hemoglobin had 100 oxygen molecules. Out of 100, it has say given out 25 oxygen molecules. This is purely for your understanding. It is left with only 75. Why did it give up those 25? Because of the fall in partial pressure from 100 and above to a PO2 of 40. But who is benefited by this 25? The tissue is benefited, because the tissue is saying, good, hemoglobin gave away 25, I am going to use that 25. So from having 100 oxygen molecule, it has come to having only 75 oxygen molecule, because of a fall in the partial pressure of oxygen. So higher the partial pressure of oxygen, greater is the friendship between hemoglobin and oxygen. Lower the partial pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin and oxygen become enemies. Hemoglobin starts giving away the oxygen molecule, and that giving away is useful to whom? It is useful for the tissues. Then there are a lot of factors that allow For example, at the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is very high, that is 105. So hemoglobin and oxygen, both of them bind together, they become friends of each other. This is only for your understanding. Now, what are the factors which favors the friendship of hemoglobin and oxygen in the alveoli? The obvious factor is PO2 should be high. Another factor is PCO2 should be low. Then in your lung, the pH is very high. The conditions are alkaline. If pH is high, the H plus ion concentration is low. So these are, and also in your lung, the temperature is very low because you are constantly ventilating your lung with the atmospheric air. So these are the factors which favor the friendship between hemoglobin and oxygen. At the tissue, I told you hemoglobin gives away oxygen, they become enemies. Why? Because partial pressure of oxygen is very low, of 40 millimeter mercury. So hemoglobin goes away from oxygen, so therefore we can say they become enemies. Now enemies as in they start hating each other, they dissociate from each other. But who is taking advantage of this? The tissue, because tissue gets oxygen. Otherwise hemoglobin only will be bound to oxygen, it will not give oxygen to the tissue at all. Tissue is very happy with this enmity because the tissue can get oxygen. Now what are some of the factors that favor this? As obviously partial pressure of oxygen should be very low as in tissues, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is very high in the tissues. Then in the tissues the pH is very low, that means the acidity is very high, H plus ion concentration is very high. And in your tissues obviously the temperature is very low, the temperature is very high because it is deep inside your body. So these are the factors which make hemoglobin and oxygen enemies, and these are the factors which make hemoglobin and oxygen friends of each other. So they should become friends in the alveoli, they should become enemies in the tissue. Why should they become enemies in the tissue? So that the tissue can get oxygen, otherwise hemoglobin only will cling on to the oxygen. Okay, so very important is the percentage saturation comes down. What had 100 oxygen with it, now hemoglobin has only 75, 25 is given out, and that is made, this is only for your example, a very crude way of explaining so that you get the concept. The 25 is taken up by the tissues. How is carbon dioxide transported? Now in this slide I am focusing mostly on the 70% transport of carbon dioxide, that is in the form of bicarbonate ion. So bicarbonate ion is transported in the plasma, and this usually happens as it is. Now we will always start with the tissues only. Okay, so in the tissue what happens is, all of you, so this is the RBC, and the surrounding fluid, the yellow colored fluid, is the plasma, and this is the tissue cells that you can see over here. So notice that carbon dioxide is entering from the tissue. Why? Because in the tissue the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40, but the blood which has come to the tissue has 45 in the tissue, but the blood which has come is oxygenated, it is 40. So from higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure, carbon dioxide will enter into the blood. From the tissue carbon dioxide is entering into the blood. Notice that this carbon dioxide enters into the RBC. 25% of it combines with hemoglobin. To be specific, it is HbNHCOOH, which is carbaminohemoglobin is formed. What about the 70%? Here we are concerned about 70%. The remaining 70% of carbon dioxide that enters your RBC from the tissue will combine with water in the presence of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will immediately split into bicarbonate ion and H plus ion. The bicarbonate ion is pumped out in response in exchange to chloride ion from outside. This is called chloride shift or Hamburger's phenomenon. Remember, if the HCO3 minus ion accumulates inside, it will cause electrical disturbance in the membrane potential of the RBC, and as a result HCO3 is sent out. So where is HCO3 being transported? HCO3 minus is now being transported temporarily in the plasma, because who is taken in exchange for HCO3 minus? Chloride ion is taken in. Okay, another byproduct of breakdown of carbonic acid is H plus. Now, which blood has come to the tissue? Oxygenated blood. That means it already has oxyhemoglobin in it. Now, when H plus ion is there, it will create an enmity between hemoglobin and oxygen. So instead, H plus will bind with hemoglobin to form hydroxyhemoglobin, and the enemy, that is oxygen of hemoglobin. Until now, hemoglobin and oxygen were best friends, but now because of H plus ion, hemoglobin is becoming best friends with hydrogen, that is H plus, and it has left its old friend, that is oxygen. It is good because this oxygen is taken up by the tissues. The tissue needs oxygen, isn't it? So what came in as the source of oxygen in the RBC? This substance which we called as oxyhemoglobin. But in the presence of H plus ion, oxyhemoglobin will dissociate into hemoglobin and oxygen. Hemoglobin will combine with H plus ion to form hydroxyhemoglobin, that is HHB. Now the reverse happens in the lungs. Let us see what happens in the lungs now. In the lungs, what happens is the HCO3 minus, which all along was in the plasma, will go back into the RBC. See, HCO3 minus was all along in the plasma. In the tissue, it entered into the plasma from the RBC. Yes or no? So now the HCO3 minus will re-enter the RBC. And who is sent out again? Chloride ion is sent out. In the tissues we saw chloride ion went in, but in the alveoli the chloride ion will go out and HCO3 minus will come in. And what is coming in the alveoli? Oxygen is coming in. Oxygen will attack HHB. It will take revenge now. In the tissue, HHB had dissociated oxygen. So because of H plus ion in the tissue, hemoglobin and oxygen had become enemies. Now it is as if oxygen is taking revenge. It is pushing out H plus ion and it is binding with hemoglobin, its old best friend, to form oxyhemoglobin. So sadly, H plus is left out, and this H plus will recombine with HCO3 minus to form H2CO3, which is dissociated into H plus and carbon dioxide. Our ultimate goal is to push out the carbon dioxide into the alveoli. So you are taking in oxygen from the alveoli and you are pushing out carbon dioxide into the alveoli. So this is how the 70% of carbon dioxide transport happens in the form of bicarbonate ions. Now in the medulla oblongata, now this is the part of your brain which is called the medulla oblongata. Now this is the medulla oblongata, this is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata. Now in the pons there is a special region that is called the pneumotaxic region. In the medulla oblongata there is a dorsal respiratory group, there is a ventral respiratory group. Together the dorsal respiratory group, which is abbreviated as DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, which is abbreviated as VRG, is both together called the respiratory rhythm center. Okay, so basically the pneumotaxic center, now this dorsal respiratory group is responsible for inspiration or inhalation, and the ventral respiratory group is responsible for expiration or exhalation. Now what happens is the pneumotaxic center, which I told you, is located in the pons. Now this pneumotaxic center has a negative influence on the dorsal respiratory group, so it will inhibit the dorsal respiratory group. So because of this pneumotaxic center, what happens is the duration of inspiration or inhalation is reduced. So otherwise we can't keep inspiring, right? At some point we have to expire. So the duration of inspiration is reduced, and as a result it alters the respiratory rate. So all of you remember, the pneumotaxic center located in the pons has a negative influence on the dorsal respiratory group. So it cuts short inspiration and it starts expiration. So pneumotaxic center reduces the duration of inspiration and alters the respiratory rate. So remember, the dorsal respiratory group is for inspiration and the ventral respiratory group is for expiration. There is another small area which is referred to as the chemosensitive area that is located in front of, on the ventral side of the medulla oblongata. So I'm writing it here. This is called the chemosensitive area. The chemosensitive area is extremely sensitive to H plus ions and partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. Whenever the H plus ion and carbon dioxide level in the blood is high, the chemosensory area will activate the dorsal respiratory group, and when it activates the dorsal respiratory group, you will inhale more. When you inhale more, you will get rid of what? You will get rid of whatever excess carbon dioxide is there and whatever H plus ion is there in your blood, because you are taking in more oxygen. Okay, so basically the chemosensitive area is very sensitive to H plus and PO2. There are several other centers which stimulate the dorsal respiratory group, which stimulate you to breathe more, because remember, dorsal respiratory group is involved in inspiration or inhaling. So that is basically, there are receptors in your aortic arch, they are called aortic receptors, and there are receptors in an artery in your neck which is called the carotid artery. So the aortic and the carotid receptors, these receptors are also very sensitive to partial pressure and H plus ion concentration. Whenever the PCO2 in the blood is high or H plus ion concentration of the blood is high, they will start sending the signal to the dorsal respiratory group, and the dorsal respiratory group will make you inhale more. And when you inhale more often, what will you do? You will help stabilize the high PO2, the high PCO2 and H plus ion concentration that is present in your blood, because you are taking in more oxygen. So PCO2 level will, and you're also, while inhaling more, you will be exhaling more also. So you will get rid of the excessive carbon dioxide present in your blood. Now respiratory volume, inspiratory reserve volume, it is about 2500 to 3000 ml. That is the additional volume of air that you can take in by forcible inspiration. Normally at a period of rest, you are breathing in and breathing out 500 ml, that is called tidal volume. And now if I ask you to forcibly breathe out, you will be putting out an excess of 1100 to 1200 ml, that is called expiratory reserve volume. Even after you breathe out forcibly, certain amount of air remains in your lung, that is called residual volume. Residual volume is about 1100 to 1200 ml. Then if you talk about the inspiratory capacity, now inspiratory capacity, all of you notice, is IRV plus tidal volume. Inspiratory capacity is the total volume of air that you can breathe in after normal expiration. So when I ask you to breathe in maximally after normal expiration, you will be taking in 500 ml of tidal volume, but because you are breathing in forcibly, you are taking in an extra inspiratory reserve volume also, isn't it? Functional residual capacity is expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. Now if I ask you to breathe out normally, what is left in your lung? Anyway, residual volume is always there. Now since you breathed out normally, you have the ERV, because ERV, to put it out, you have to breathe out forcibly, but I asked you to breathe out normally, so you retain both ERV and RV, that is called functional residual volume. Vital capacity is IRV plus tidal volume plus ERV. So it is the total volume of air, or we can call it as the maximum volume of air a person can inspire after forcible expiration. I ask you to breathe out forcibly, you have emptied everything in your lung except residual volume. And then I ask you to inspire maximally. What all will you take in? You had breathed out forcibly, so you gave out ERV, you will take in that ERV. Then normally when you are breathing in, you are taking in TV. Plus, because it is forcible inspiration, you are taking in an extra inspiratory reserve volume, etc. So in order to take in the expiratory reserve volume, you had to carry out forcible expiration. So the maximum volume of air a person can inspire after forcible expiration is referred to as the vital capacity, that is ERV plus TV plus IRV. Then how do you define the total lung capacity? The maximum volume of air that is present in the lungs, isn't it, after forcible inspiration. Now what all is there in your lungs, that is accommodated in your lungs once you have inspired forcibly? Already ERV and RV is there in your lungs, because you did not breathe out forcibly. RV is always there in your lungs. Now you have been asked to breathe in forcibly, so you took in TV and IRV. So what all is there in your lungs at the end? All the four components are there. That is referred to as total lung capacity. Okay. Respiratory disorders like bronchitis, which is caused due to hypertrophy, that is increase in the size, as well as excessive proliferation of the cells, especially the goblet cells and certain gland cells which are present in the bronchi, and this may be caused due to exposure to pollutants or smoking. And asthma, as you all know, is an allergic response to foreign substances, and there is rapid uncontrolled contractions and relaxations of the smooth muscles of the wall of the bronchiole, and you know that an asthmatic patient suffers from severe breathing difficulty with a wheezing like sound whenever the person is having an asthmatic attack. Excess mucus is also secreted during asthma because it is an allergic response to a foreign substance that the person has inhaled, and that will result in clogging of the bronchi and the bronchioles. Emphysema is a condition where there is damage to the alveoli. Why there is damage to the alveoli, or the surface area of the alveoli becomes lesser because the surface gets damaged due to, say for example, the cigarette smoking. Then you have pneumonia, which is caused by Diplococcus pneumoniae or Streptococcus pneumoniae, which are bacterial agents which can cause pneumonia. One of the major features of pneumonia is alveoli get filled with a fluid, and as a result, the body tissues are not getting enough oxygen. Then there are people who are working in certain specific occupations, like for example, people working in silica, stone grinding or stone crushing factories, which suffer from silicosis, and asbestos factories suffer from asbestosis because they are constantly inhaling these finer dust particles, which will cause irritation to the lining of the bronchial tubes, and so the bronchial tubes will develop excess collagen fibers in an attempt to overcome this irritation, and therefore they become rigid, they lose their elasticity. So when the tissue in the lung gradually gets replaced by collagen fibers, it is referred to as the fibrosis. It is caused, like I said, by inhalation of dust associated with workplace, and that's why it is called occupational diseases like asbestos and silicon. And then you can talk about another condition, which is hypoxia. Hypoxia is where, because of all these disorders, different parts of the body, or on the whole, the entire body, is suffering from a deprivation of adequate oxygen supply, and this condition is referred to as hypoxia. So this completes the summary or the synopsis of the chapter, breathing and exchange of gases. Thank you.